Welcome to part 1 of the Residential Purchase Agreement video. This video will describe the first few pages of the most commonly used contract to purchase residential real estate in California. The Residential Purchase Agreement, or RPA as we call it, is an 8-page contract that a buyer completes to offer to purchase a home from a seller. When I sit down with my clients to write an offer on a home, this is one of the first documents that we complete. Often it can take over an hour for us to go through this agreement in detail. The intent of this video is to give you a sense of what this contract covers and what types of things you might think about if you're a buyer looking to write an offer or a seller who receives an offer on this form. On the top right corner of the RPA is a date. This is a very important field as any subsequent counteroffers, amendments, or other contractual items will reference the RPA dated a certain date, in this case, November 11th, 2011. Paragraph 1A, this is an offer from, in this case, John Q. Sample and Jane H. Sample. Those are going to be the legal name or names of the buyer or buyers. 1B details the property that's going to be purchased, including the street address, the tax assessor's number, and the county. 1C is the purchase price. In this case, John and Jane Sample are offering $650,000 to purchase the property at 12345 Any Street in Anytown, California. This number that is put in here, the purchase price, is a number that should be reached in consultation with your realtor, and this is something that the buyers decide. So the buyers are the ones that are going to decide what to offer here. Paragraph 2A begins with a disclosure that both the buyer and the seller acknowledge that they've received a form called Disclosure Regarding Real Estate Agency Relationships. This document, which again we often just refer to as an agency disclosure form, should be one of the first forms that you are handed by a real estate agent once you get to know them, beyond just a casual hello. It discloses important information about how agents work on a transaction and what their responsibilities are. 2B indicates that you have received in that disclosure the possibility of multiple representation. So the broker could be representing both the buyer and the seller, or the broker could be representing more than one buyer who might be trying to make offers on this same property. And the seller understands that the broker represents sellers, and they may also represent other sellers who have competing interests. 2C, again very critical, is that as the buyer, you are confirming that you understand the agency relationships. So the listing agent, that's going to be the one who put the property on the market, in this case is any real estate company, that's the name of the company of the broker, and in this case they're the agent of the seller exclusively. And the selling agent, the person representing the buyer, in this case is Prudential California Realty, me, and I'm the agent of the buyer exclusively. If my broker happened to have the listing through another agent in my office, then both of these fields would say Prudential California Realty, and we would check the box that says representing both the buyer and the seller. Paragraph 3 now gets into the specific financial terms of how the buyer is intending to purchase the property. And this is really important because especially when you end up in a multiple offer situation, sometimes there might be all cash buyers, sometimes there might be buyers that are putting 20% down, 40% down. It all just depends, and the seller needs to evaluate this. So in this case, this is a pretty traditional transaction. The John and Jane are intending to put 20% down and get a loan for the rest. However, they're going to begin with an initial deposit. This is just an initial deposit of 3% of the purchase price. This is a good number because that's the amount that we're limited by law to receive in liquidated damages, which comes later in the contract. So this is the amount of the initial check that'll either be handed to the agent directly as a good faith deposit, earnest money deposit, or once escrow is opened, be deposited directly with escrow. And in fact, in 3A, it specifically says in this particular one, buyer shall deposit directly to escrow holder by personal check, or if we wanted to, we could check electronic funds transfer within 3 business days after acceptance. So once we have an agreed upon contract, the buyer would have 3 business days to get this $19,500 over to escrow. Or if we had checked box number 2, the buyer could have given the deposit by personal check to the agent submitting the offer or to someone else. So there's a lot of options here. And in that case, the deposit is held uncashed until acceptance and then deposited with the escrow holder. These days, with all of the electronic signatures we're doing and a lot of different things, it is possible to just use this default of delivering it directly to escrow. 3B is an increased deposit. So sometimes the seller may negotiate that once contingencies have been removed or other kinds of things, that you want to increase the deposit beyond the initial 3%. In this case, John and Jane are not offering that up front. That could, of course, be negotiated during a counteroffer. 3C details the loan information, and in this case, again, John and Jane, having very good credit, are going with a traditional 80% first trust deed. They're not getting FHA or VA, so it does say this loan will be conventional financing. In this case, we did not complete what the loan, if it's at a fixed rate, not to exceed a certain percentage, or an adjustable rate loan. These can be put in, and sometimes are put in, to protect the buyer from a sudden spike in interest rates. In this case, since interest rates have been very low and seem to be pretty stable, John and Jane have elected, in this case, not to fill out these forms, these blanks. Also, in this case, there is no second loan, but if there were going to be a second loan, we would check this box, put the amount in, and again, talk about whether it's conventional financing or seller financing, assumed financing, or something else. And C3, if the buyer is using an FHA or VA loan, the buyer has 17 days by default, or we can check this box and put in additional or lesser days after acceptance to deliver to seller the written notice of any lender required repairs or costs that the buyer wants the seller to pay for. So FHA and VA, often when they do their appraisal, there may be some required repairs or costs that the buyer can't afford and therefore is requesting the seller to pay for. If there are any other additional financing terms, they would be detailed here, and then the form automatically calculates the remainder. In this case, this would be the remainder of the 20% down, which totals to the purchase price. So, and then if this is all correct, the buyers would initial here on both of these pages, and that finishes up page 1. Moving on to page 2, you can see that every page has the property address and the date of the contract to ensure that we're working on the right forms. This is going to be paragraph 3G. This is the verification of down payment and closing costs. The buyer has, by default, 7 days after acceptance to deliver to the seller verification that the buyer has the down payment and closing costs. In today's market, to make it look very competitive, we often recommend that buyers actually provide this verification, which can come in the form of copies of bank statements, immediately upon submitting the offer. It's not required, but it does make it easier to talk about, to prove that the buyer is legitimate. 3H is the loan terms. So 3H1 talks essentially about a pre-approval letter. And again, we recommend in this market that buyers actually provide this pre-approval letter with the contract or with the offer. But the contract does say that you have to do it within 7 days after acceptance. H2 indicates that the buyer is going to act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loans, and that obtaining the loans is a contingency of this agreement unless otherwise agreed in writing. What it means to act diligently is to turn in the paperwork and other things that are requested by the mortgage broker in order to complete the loan. Buyer's contractual obligations to obtain and provide deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies. So if the buyer misrepresents that they actually have the money, that's not a reason within the contract to be able to cancel the contract. So, but however, if the loan is not able to be obtained, that is a reason to cancel the contract. 3H3, loan contingency removal, within 17 days is the default, or again, we could change it by putting another number in here. After acceptance, the buyer shall, in writing, remove the loan contingency. And as we get later on in the contract, when we talk about time frames, we can talk more about what a contingency is. But again, it's remove the contingency or cancel. So basically, a contingency in this case is a reason to legitimately cancel the agreement. And as long as the contingency is in place, the buyer has the right to cancel this agreement. Once the contingency has been removed, then that particular reason is no longer a legitimate reason to cancel this agreement. If we're not getting a loan, or we choose not to make the loan a contingency, then you would check this box. 3I, appraisal contingency and removal. Again, this agreement is, or if checked is not, contingent upon a written appraisal, and that it appraises at no less than the specified purchase price. So again, if the appraisal is done and it comes back and says, well, this property is not worth $650,000, it's worth $625,000, then the buyer has the option to back out of the contract. If there's a loan contingency and the buyer removes that loan contingency, then it's implied that the appraisal contingency is removed as well. Or again, we can alter that and say that we have to actually remove it in writing. And if there's no loan contingency, then the buyer shall in writing remove the appraisal contingency. 3J, if there is no loan and this happens to be an all cash offer, we would check this. And again, buyers shall within 7 days after acceptance deliver written verification of the funds to close this transaction. Or if we're providing the proof of funds up front, we would check here and say verification is attached. 3K, the buyer stated financing clause, that the seller is relying on the buyer's representation of the type of financing. So if the buyer says, I'm paying all cash, and then all of a sudden wants to get a loan, the seller doesn't have to cooperate. They can, but they don't have to. So it says here, buyer's failure to secure alternate financing does not excuse buyer from the obligation to purchase the property. This is the end of part 1. I'll look forward to talking to you in part 2.